Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. Rumors began spreading around Redwood Biocenter about an unusual wave of bird fatalities in distant regions. Species as different as sparrows and seabirds were turning up with identical symptoms: disorientation, rapid weight loss, and an unexplained drive to gather near populated areas. Then they simply stopped moving. Around that time, Redwood's funding partners insisted on a specialized task force to investigate. I was assigned to that group because of my background in virology. At first, the data was inconclusive. Environmental pollutants or harsh weather patterns were suggested by some. Others believed it might be a strain of avian influenza. Though anxious, the Redwood leadership pressed us for answers. Days stretched into nights. We examined tissue samples gathered from different continents, each pointing to a pattern of infection that we could not fully categorize. Dr. Renfield headed the task force. He was the sort of person who radiated confidence in a crisis, always reminding us that Redwood's labs were built for intense research challenges. Under his guidance, we isolated a strange pathogen in the bird tissue. It looked like influenza, but behaved unpredictably in cell cultures, shifting properties each time we attempted to lock onto its genetic signature. We joked that it was a chameleon virus, even though everyone suspected it would stop surprising us once we had more time to study it. The deeper we delved, the more this pathogen defied simple classification. Some of us wanted to alert government health agencies that we'd found something new. Others insisted we wait until we had concrete evidence. Redwood had a reputation for not sounding alarms prematurely. Meanwhile, outside reports confirmed that wildlife rehab centers were overwhelmed by birds that arrived exhibiting the same symptoms. Public news outlets noted a rise in mysterious avian incidents, though no direct link to human disease was yet suggested. Then came the morning when a staff member, Terry, rushed into the lab with a sparrow found just outside Redwood's main entrance. The poor creature was struggling to fly, feathers missing, eyes unfocused. Terry believed we had a perfect live sample to analyze. We gently placed the sparrow into a secure enclosure. Almost immediately, our monitoring systems recorded an intense viral load in its tissues. We realized the pathogen was present in Redwood's immediate surroundings. It was no longer a distant worry. Administration introduced new rules. We were told to avoid direct contact with any wildlife. The facility installed additional safety checkpoints. Everyone underwent daily health checks, especially those working in containment labs. 2 interns were sent home after complaining of persistent headaches, although we never confirmed if they had an infection. In those early days, Redwood's staff tried to maintain a normal routine. The cafeteria still served coffee. The corridors were calm, but the whispered conversations hinted at growing concern. Some employees muttered that we might be sitting on the edge of a global threat, especially if the pathogen could jump to humans. Our task force conducted a set of experiments with mice to see if the disease could move between birds and mammals. This step felt like a formality at first. Nearly everyone hoped the virus was restricted to avian hosts. When the first mouse began displaying odd behavior, racing around its enclosure, then collapsing in a corner, our entire lab fell silent. In time, several mice exposed to the bird samples exhibited faster breathing and reduced awareness of their environment. Later, they became aggressive. They tried to gnaw through the plastic dividers. The caretaker team, always vigilant about wearing gloves and protective suits, was unsettled by how quickly the mice shifted from disorientation to hostility. It was reminiscent of certain severe forms of rabies, but it progressed at an abnormal pace. Dr. Hall observed that each infected mouse's eyes developed a cloudy appearance, and they no longer responded to typical stimuli. They just wanted to bite, as though guided by an internal command. Redwood's staff had never seen a pathogen that reached this level of brain involvement so fast. We labeled it a neurological disruptor, lacking more precise language. At Redwood, No day passed without a new rumor. Whispers spread of a technician who cleaned up after the mice, then complained of dizziness. Another staff member was seen rushing to the infirmary after a lab mishap involving a splashed sample. Though I lacked direct evidence, the possibility that people were getting sick gnawed at me. Then, Redwood's management held a sudden assembly. Dr. Lowen, the facility director, approached the podium in the main conference hall. His expression was measured, but there was an urgency in his tone. We learned that multiple employees had tested positive for an unusual viral agent. All of them exhibited fever and subtle shifts in behavior. He stressed that the situation was under close watch and Redwood's containment protocols would suffice. Instead of easing concerns, the announcement left the staff unsettled. We had never experienced an active outbreak inside Redwood. Some felt Redwood's leadership was downplaying the seriousness, possibly due to pressure from outside sponsors. Others, like Dr. Renfield, quietly hinted that we needed more resources to prevent an event that could spiral if not contained. The next few days blurred into a cycle of testing, retesting, and waiting for updates. I recall writing code to automate the analysis of our lab's datasets, trying to find any pattern in the virus's structure. Each time, the code output revealed that the pathogen changed in ways we couldn't predict. During that same stretch, Redwood's internal messaging system posted an urgent bulletin. Multiple staff have been placed under strict observation. Symptoms include confusion, erratic movements, and potential aggression. If you experience any sudden changes in health, report immediately to the medical unit. The phrase, potential aggression, stood out. Our top leadership avoided using terms like violent or dangerous. But in hush-hush conversations, we acknowledged that we were facing something that affected the mind, stripping away normal behavior. A rumor surfaced about Dr. Shin encountering an infected colleague who tried to bite him. It sounded exaggerated, the sort of wild gossip that emerges in tense situations. Yet in the back of my mind, I wondered if the story was true. All employees were told to limit social interactions, remain in small groups, and avoid unnecessary movement between lab sections. A partial lockdown followed. Biometric doors only allowed clearance to a handful of staff in each corridor. The cafeteria served pre-packaged meals. Security officers patrolled more frequently, dressed in protective coverings I had never seen them wear. On the third day of partial lockdown, I stepped into the corridor to refill a water bottle and saw a figure in a lab coat standing a few meters away. The corridor lights flickered, making it hard to see clearly. When I drew closer, I recognized the figure as one of our pathology lab members. She looked at me with an unfocused stare. Before I could speak, she turned and walked away with an unsteady stride. I hesitated, unsure whether to follow, but then decided to head back to the lab. We prided ourselves on carefully controlled experiments, but soon enough, we discovered that small mammals around the facility grounds, like squirrels, were displaying odd behaviors. Some were found immobile in the bushes. Others ran in circles as though disoriented. It became clear the pathogen was not isolated to lab mice or to Redwood's environment. If wild animals were infected, then the zone of potential spread was far larger than any facility boundary. We received fleeting updates from outside Redwood, indicating that bird populations in cities across the country were collapsing. Media outlets started speculating on a global bird pandemic. There was little mainstream mention of humans falling ill, except for a few unverified accounts on social media. Redwood scientists, however, knew the truth was more complex. We had seen direct evidence that people could become infected. I remember the moment the Redwood internal alarms blared with an urgency that signaled a serious crisis. A synthesized voice looped over the loudspeakers, instructing everyone to remain in their current areas. From within my lab, I heard distant shouts through the sealed doors. My colleagues and I exchanged uneasy looks. We tried to contact the main security desk, but our calls went unanswered. Then the voice of Dr. Lowen came over the loudspeakers. All staff, we have a containment breach in the E corridor. Security teams are responding. Await further instructions. Remain calm. My lab was in the F corridor, so the breach was relatively close. I tried to focus on our immediate tasks, but it was impossible. We were well aware that Redwood's structure included heavy blast doors that could seal off entire sections. Whatever had gone wrong must have been significant enough to trigger that level of response. Hours passed. No additional announcements were made. The labs grew restless. Some staff used the internal messaging system to swap theories, but official details were scarce. Meanwhile, shrieks and crashes reverberated from behind the steel doors. Occasionally, the overhead lights dimmed and came back on. Eventually, Redwood's lockdown extended facility-wide. Doors sealed, the ventilation system defaulted to minimal operation, and our lab's normal hum quieted to a distant drone. A few labs, including mine, had enough rations to last for a day or two. We were instructed to stay put, which we did. That night, or what we assumed was nighttime, we heard footsteps outside the lab. Someone pounded on our door, calling for help. We tried the electronic controls, but the system wouldn't let us open it. A colleague peered through the small glass panel and saw a staff member in a tattered coat stumbling away down the corridor. I wanted to chase after them, but the lockdown was absolute. A short time later, a new message flashed on our lab consoles. Emergency alert. The pathogen has mutated into a form that causes extreme aggression. Infected individuals must be approached with caution. Do not open secure doors without clearance. The text used words we'd never seen in Redwood communications. Extreme aggression. The earlier rumors about biting suddenly felt entirely credible. I spent several tense hours trying to distract myself by sorting lab data, but my concentration slipped. The next day, Redwood's power grid faltered, plunging half the building into darkness. We had about a dozen people in our lab, each with different specialties. Dr. Hall was a microbiologist who tried to keep morale up by discussing potential treatments. Another was Rowan, a security officer who'd been locked in with us when the doors sealed. He had limited medical knowledge but insisted he could defend us if the worst happened. Our group formed a small circle near the main workstation. Dr. Hall wanted to gather resources, protective suits, masks, tools, for an eventual escape. Redwood's internal messages had mentioned an external response team coming to help, but we never saw them. After 2 days of no further instructions, we began to think that Redwood might not receive outside support at all. Meanwhile, the overhead speaker occasionally played a loop. Emergency alert. A new pathogen is present. Transmission from birds to humans has occurred. Infected individuals exhibit disoriented behavior and may become hostile. Seek protective shelter. Hearing the same loop over and over built a sense of dread. We realized Redwood was basically telling us to save ourselves, but we had no direct path out. Rowan managed to override our lab door after studying the wiring. We gathered what we could: lab coats, helmets from the hazardous materials supply, and a single metal rod as a makeshift defensive tool. Our plan involved finding a route to Redwood's cargo bay, where vehicles were stored. We hoped to use a truck or van to exit the facility. Creeping into the corridor was an unsettling experience. The regular lighting was off, replaced by emergency spotlights every few meters. Clutter lined the floors, scattered papers, overturned carts, half-eaten snack packets. The air had a stale odor. We turned a corner and saw movement near the far end. It looked like a person wearing Redwood scrubs, hunched at an odd angle. With each step, the figure's limbs moved in jerky motions. Rowan motioned for us to stay quiet. We tried to pass unnoticed, but the figure spun around, revealing half-lidded eyes. It hurried toward us with surprising speed. Rowan placed himself in front, rod raised. The figure ignored the obvious threat, continuing to move forward. Eventually, Rowan managed to force it aside, and it tumbled against a wall. We used that moment to slip past. I caught a glimpse of the figure's face, which showed no recognition. It was as if the virus had pushed aside every trace of a normal person. Pressing on, we saw more signs that Redwood had become a testing ground for chaos. Some doors were dented, as though hammered from the inside. Glass panels were smeared with strange marks. Now and then, we heard people calling out for help, or perhaps they were making sounds that resembled pleas. The entire structure felt as though it had lost its sense of order. Over the building's emergency broadcasting system, we heard a new directive. All uninfected personnel should attempt to reach the sub-level evacuation zone. A rescue operation is being prepared. It gave us something to work with. If Redwood had a designated sub-level evacuation area, maybe we could regroup with other survivors. Dr. Hall insisted we follow the signs towards that section, hoping we'd find a functioning exit or get medical assistance. Our small group navigated deeper into Redwood, passing labs we had never visited before. The air felt warmer, as the climate control system was failing. One corridor led to an elevator bank, but the power seemed off. We pried open a door to the stairwell and found it pitch black. Using a couple of flashlights, we descended multiple flights, trying not to make noise. On one landing, we discovered a Redwood security officer slumped against the wall. He was conscious but seemed disoriented. We approached cautiously. He attempted to speak, but his words were jumbled. Dr. Hall checked him for visible injuries. His uniform badge read Officer Grant. He might have avoided full infection, or maybe he was in the earliest stage. We weren't sure. He pointed downward, as if to warn us of something. We tried to get more information, but his speech made little sense. Rowan suggested we keep moving. I didn't want to abandon him, but Dr. Hall feared he was already infected and might become a danger. Eventually, we decided to help him to his feet and guide him along. Arriving at the sub-level, we saw that the main door was propped open with a heavy crate. Beyond it, an entire corridor flickered under emergency lights. The walls had signs reading "Evac route," but the place was nearly empty. We found footprints on the floor, as though many people had come this way. Where had they gone? A few steps in, we heard a faint metallic clang, like someone hitting the side of a vent. We paused. Then a voice called out softly. Dr. Hall responded, and a lab assistant emerged from a side corridor. She was alone, extremely shaken. She said a group of Redwood staff had assembled in a designated safe room, but some infected broke through. People scattered in different directions. We asked if any official rescue team had arrived. She shook her head. She only knew that Redwood leadership had broadcast a final directive to head for the cargo bay. Then the building's communications went dark. By now, the group included me, Dr. Hall, Rowan, the shaken lab assistant, and the security officer who could barely speak. We still aimed for the cargo bay, believing that if Redwood had any functioning exit, it would be there. The sub-level might have had tunnels, but we didn't know how to navigate them. We ascended a different stairwell to avoid the route we came from, hoping the cargo bay wouldn't be too far. The more we advanced, the more we saw Redwood's meltdown. Broken lighting fixtures, occasional scuffling noises behind closed doors, and flickers of movement at the edges of our flashlights. Eventually, we arrived at the corridor leading to Redwood's cargo bay. The overhead sign read "Deliveries" in large letters. The door had a red emergency bar across it, partially dented. Rowan leaned his weight against it, trying to pry it open. With a final push, it gave way, revealing a wide industrial space filled with stacked crates, forklifts, and a few large vehicles. Dim moonlight filtered in through high windows, since night had likely fallen outside. We saw one delivery van near the bay door. Its cargo doors were open, and the interior lights were off. Nearby, we glimpsed two individuals moving with the unsteady motions we now recognized all too well. We slowed our steps, hoping to slip by without drawing their attention. One of them turned abruptly and faced us, eyes distant and posture tense. A small grunt came from their throat. Rowan signaled for us to move to the far side of the van. We crept around, trying to stay out of their direct line of sight. The second individual soon noticed us. It rushed our direction, arms outstretched. Despite the dim light, the Redwood uniform was visible, though torn and stained with substances we didn't care to identify. Rowan stepped forward with the metal rod, hoping to create distance. The infected person flailed, striking at Rowan with surprising force. Dr. Hall tried to pull Rowan back. In the confusion, the other infected figure joined, though it seemed less certain of our location. We realized we had only a brief window to jump into the van. Dr. Hall yanked the passenger door open. I helped the shaken lab assistant climb inside. Rowan managed to shove the first attacker back, then slipped into the van after me. Officer Grant, who was still unsteady, needed support getting into the rear of the van. The infected staff lurched forward again, one grabbing at the door handle. Rowan kicked the door shut from the inside just in time. We scrambled to locate the keys. A ring of them dangled from the ignition. Someone in Redwood must have set this up, hoping to escape but never made it back. Dr. Hall took the driver's seat. The engine sputtered once, then roared to life. The infected staff smacked the van's windows with open palms. The glass held. Dr. Hall put the vehicle in gear, maneuvering around crates. The large bay door at the front of the cargo area was halfway open, jammed at an angle. She pressed on the accelerator, and the van inched underneath, scraping the top slightly before bursting into the cool night air. Outside Redwood, we saw fences with gates left ajar. The security booth was empty. A single spotlight lit the road that twisted away from the facility. We followed it, adrenaline surging with every bump on the pavement. For a moment, an eerie calm settled. Then we realized Redwood was behind us, but the world ahead might be in no better shape. Driving away, we noticed occasional lights flickering in the distance. We picked up a local radio station for a few seconds, a static-filled broadcast repeating an official statement. Emergency alert. The pathogen is spreading. Individuals should remain indoors. Contact with infected persons or wildlife must be avoided. Follow instructions from local authorities if available. That was the first time I heard an official source call it the zombie virus. Everyone in the van exchanged glances, as if that label confirmed our worst fears. We had been studying this very agent. Our experiments showed how fast it attacked the nervous system, how it triggered a relentless drive to spread. Now, it had a name broadcast to the public. We reached a crossroads. The lab assistant suggested heading to a nearby town, hoping to find supplies. Dr. Hall argued that dense areas might harbor more infected. We had no perfect solution. Eventually, we decided to drive on rural roads looking for an abandoned gas station. Hours passed. The night sky was only slightly illuminated by the moon, and the roads were deserted. We stopped at a small service station, but found the pumps inactive. The building was locked and dark. Rowan stepped out to try the door. In the faint glow of our headlights, we saw silhouettes of birds lying near the windows. They looked like they had fallen from the sky, matching the avian tragedy that started this entire chain of events. We managed to pry open the service station door. Inside, the shelves had been mostly cleared. We scrounged what we could. Bottled water, a few snack bars. The place felt abandoned, with no sign of staff or any infected individuals. Officer Grant rested in a corner. He said little, though his breathing had steadied. Leaving the station, we refocused on the road. At intervals, the radio repeated that same bulletin about a global crisis. Occasionally, static would yield to frantic voices describing entire neighborhoods shutting down. Some transmissions cut out mid-sentence, as though the stations had lost power. Eventually, we found a small warehouse compound not too far from the main highway. It appeared empty. We drove around the perimeter to check for signs of infected. Only a few scattered bird remains and some stray footprints in the dust. We decided to park behind the building, out of sight from the road. Inside the warehouse, we discovered stacked crates and old machinery. It didn't look like a safe haven, but it offered some shelter while we thought of our next move. We set up a small camp in an office corner. Dr. Hall distributed the snack bars we'd collected, and we used boxes as makeshift seats. We took turns napping. Each time I closed my eyes, Redwood's corridors and the infected staff haunted my thoughts. I knew we had been lucky to escape. Yet what about the countless others still inside those locked rooms? And what about the possibility that Redwood staff had already left, scattering the infection across nearby towns. The bigger picture was frightening. While we sheltered there, I tried to organize my notes on a portable device. The data from Redwood, the logs of infected mice, the analysis of the virus's structure. If we ever reached a functional research center or a group of scientists, maybe we could help find a response. I kept telling myself that Redwood's downfall wouldn't be the end of the story if we could share what we learned. Rowan asked me about the virus's timeline. He wanted to know how quickly an infected person reached the stage where they lost higher reasoning. From what we saw at Redwood, it could vary from hours to a day or two. Factors like a person's immune system might influence it. Dr. Hall added that the presence of certain bird strains in the environment could speed up local spread. Our knowledge felt disjointed, like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. After a brief rest, we ventured out again, following smaller roads. We occasionally glimpsed figures on the roadside, but it was hard to know if they were travelers or infected. We opted not to take risks, continuing on. We noticed that many shops were closed, windows boarded up, and gas stations were deserted. The sky had a hazy cast. Maybe it was just morning mist, or maybe smoke from distant fires. We couldn't be certain. In one small town, we passed a local diner with its lights on. We paused at the curb. The windows revealed tables overturned, flickering neon signs, and no sign of people. It was an unsettling sight, as though everyone had departed mid-shift. Dr. Hall wanted to check inside for supplies, but a shape shifted behind the counter. We weren't sure if it was infected, so we quietly left. At intervals, we found a weak government broadcast on the radio. Emergency alert. The zombie virus has reached multiple regions. Citizens should shelter in place and avoid gatherings. If contact with infected occurs, seek medical assistance immediately. Expert teams are searching for a containment solution. Yet no specific safe zones were listed. It was as if the entire region was locked in a struggle to figure out the next steps. We had Redwood's data, but we were just a handful of people in a van, drifting through deserted highways. Officer Grant dozed in the back, periodically asking if Redwood might have retaken control. There was no sign of Redwood's recovery anywhere on the airwaves. On the second day of traveling, we encountered a small settlement at the edge of farmland. A few residents peered from windows. As soon as they saw our vehicle, they retreated indoors. We stopped and tried calling out, asking if they needed help. Nobody responded. We sensed that trust was in short supply. People probably feared letting strangers get close, worrying about infection. We drove on, feeling the weight of our limited supplies. The lab assistant from Redwood insisted on finding a place with stable power, so we could attempt contact with any functional research center. It was a good idea, but so far, every place we passed lacked obvious signs of stable infrastructure. Each morning, I scrolled through Redwood's archived data on my device. It reminded me of everything we had discovered about the virus. This was not a slow-moving pathogen. It adapted. It amplified certain aggressive instincts in its host. Wildlife, especially birds, were prime carriers, but humans were also vulnerable. It was a scenario we used to read about in theoretical outbreak simulations, except now it was real. From glimpses of the news, we learned that major cities had declared states of emergency. Hospitals were over capacity, and local authorities asked everyone to remain indoors. Travel was discouraged. Military vehicles were spotted near large metropolitan areas, possibly enforcing quarantines. No mention of Redwood specifically, though I had no doubt that if Redwood was named at all, it would be associated with the initial research. After endless hours cooped up in the van, tension surfaced. Officer Grant believed we should find a hidden, less populated area and settle in until authorities neutralized the crisis. The lab assistant, however, insisted that we had a duty to share Redwood's data with official channels or some functioning research group. Rowan wavered between both viewpoints. Dr. Hall tried to mediate, suggesting we keep moving until we spotted a reliable outpost, perhaps a hospital or a shelter facility. As for me, I couldn't ignore the feeling that Redwood's knowledge was crucial, but our primary objective was immediate survival. We compromised by continuing to drive, scanning the radio for any sign of an organized zone. In the late evening, we approached a large bridge. The van's fuel gauge hovered near empty. We decided to see if we could cross the river and perhaps find a station on the other side. Mid-bridge, 3 vehicles blocked the lanes. It looked like an accident. The headlights of one car were still on, weakly illuminating the scene. We advanced slowly. Rowan stepped out first, shining a flashlight at the blockade. A single figure appeared from behind one of the cars, arms raised in a defensive stance. Rowan called out, declaring we were travelers in need of fuel. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it staggered towards us with uneven steps. Dr. Hall recognized the same vacant expression we had seen in Redwood's corridors. We reversed the van, narrowly avoiding another figure that approached from the side. Both displayed the same signs: disoriented movement, no attempt at communication. We retreated, choosing not to risk going through that blockade. Another route would have to do. At times when the group dozed, I recorded my thoughts into a digital journal. I confessed my sense of responsibility. Maybe Redwood should have sounded the alarm earlier. Maybe we should have alerted world agencies the moment we realized how aggressive the virus was in mice. But Redwood was bound by certain protocols, along with external pressures to avoid creating panic. I also acknowledged the resilience of the people with me. Dr. Hall, dedicated to finding a solution even while we roamed empty roads. Rowan, risking personal safety to guide us. The lab assistant, who overcame constant anxiety to remain helpful. And even Officer Grant, who, despite his disorientation, seemed determined to stay with the group instead of giving in to despair. Eventually, we reached a modest rest area surrounded by forest. A single payphone stood outside a closed building. It was ancient technology, but Dr. Hall tried it anyway. Surprisingly, there was a dial tone. She attempted to contact a local operator but got no response. We decided to see if we could reach any known emergency lines, though every attempt failed or disconnected immediately. Nevertheless, this small success of finding a working payphone gave us a spark of hope. If some communication lines were still active, maybe not everything had collapsed. We decided to remain at the rest area overnight, using the van's interior as sleeping space. During our stay at the rest area, we fiddled with a shortwave radio device that Rowan found in the van. We detected a faint automated broadcast on a repeating loop. Medical facility operational at County General. Supplies limited. Approach with caution. This was the first direct lead we had. County General was about 30 miles away, if we guessed correctly from the route we'd taken. The next morning we set out, determined to see if the medical facility existed. As we traveled, we spotted more signs of chaos. Vehicles abandoned along the highway, some with open doors. Occasionally crows circled overhead, though many birds on the ground appeared to be ill or no longer moving. We avoided major roads, fearing that checkpoints might be in place or that the infected would be more concentrated. Late that afternoon, we saw a sign for County General Hospital. The building loomed on the horizon, surrounded by an empty parking lot dotted with a few damaged cars. We approached slowly, scanning for movement. A sign near the front entrance had been put up reading, "Quarantine in effect." Rowan parked the van near the main doors. We ventured inside, calling out to see if anyone was there. The lobby lights flickered. A few chairs were stacked against the walls. A sign-in sheet lay scattered across a table. This did not feel like a functioning medical facility. A faint buzzing sound came from the intercom system overhead. We moved farther, passing what must have been the emergency department. Beds stood empty, with monitors powered down. The entire place smelled of antiseptic that had gone stale. We found a corridor leading deeper into the building, lit by emergency lighting. Eventually, we reached a locked double door with a sign reading, "Authorized personnel only." Beyond the glass panels, we spotted a makeshift quarantine area filled with cots. Dr. Hall noticed minimal movement, like someone shifting on one of the beds. She tapped on the glass, hoping to draw attention. A figure in a medical coat appeared, face partially obscured by a mask. They looked at us, then motioned for us to step back. After a few moments, they opened the door slightly, holding a small flashlight. The person introduced themselves as Dr. Walters, part of a skeleton crew that stayed behind when most staff evacuated. We explained our background and shared that we possessed data on the virus from Redwood. Dr. Walters ushered us in quickly, shutting the door behind us. Inside, we found a corridor lined with a handful of cots. A few people lay resting, although no staff seemed to be actively tending to them besides Dr. Walters. He told us the hospital had tried to remain operational, but supplies ran out and the risk of infection increased. Most of the staff relocated to a distant checkpoint that might or might not still be active. Dr. Walters stayed behind to assist stragglers who arrived. We settled on a few chairs near the quarantine area. Dr. Walters listened as we described Redwood's downfall. Dr. Hall offered our device containing research notes on how the virus invaded neural pathways. Dr. Walters flipped through the data for a while, occasionally pausing to ask clarifying questions. He confirmed that County General had treated multiple cases of people bitten by infected individuals. Some recovered physically but still showed neurological changes. Others succumbed to the infection in a matter of hours. The staff used every available treatment approach, but nothing halted the virus's progression once it took hold. Dr. Walters revealed that an informal network of medical professionals was still communicating through shortwave transmissions. He had tried to keep contact with them. Those signals were weak. He believed there might be pockets of organized resistance in certain regions, small labs or universities trying to develop a vaccine. We gave him Redwood's complete data set. If those labs were still functional, maybe they could piece together something from Redwood's initial experiments. Dr. Hall found a measure of relief that our knowledge wouldn't be lost. I felt the same, though my relief was tempered by exhaustion. Staying at County General wasn't an option. Dr. Walters encouraged us to keep traveling until we found a stable zone, or we might risk being trapped in an area with no supplies. He handed us a small bag of medical items, apologizing for not having more. Officer Grant spoke up for the first time in a clear voice, asking if Dr. Walters would join us. The doctor shook his head, insisting he had an obligation to any more survivors who wandered in. He said the virus might eventually reach him, but he would do his duty. We thanked him, made sure the van was still fueled enough for more driving, and prepared to depart. Dr. Walters walked us to the main door, cautioning us that infected individuals had been spotted near some of the roads leading out of the town. We pulled away from County General with renewed perspective. The Redwood data was now in the hands of at least one outside medical professional, possibly more if Dr. Walters managed to share it. Our journey continued. Over the next few days, we traveled side roads, picking up only fragments of broadcast news. We heard repeated warnings about migrating birds. Various communities reported entire flocks collapsing mid-flight, and the possibility of infected animals crossing state lines. The phrase zombie virus was used so casually now that it seemed to have lost its shock factor. Everyone, it appeared, accepted that the world was dealing with something never seen before. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.